I want to preach this morning from the subject, the birth of a new nation, and I would like to use as a basis for our thinking together a story that has long since been stenciled in the mental sheets of succeeding generations. It is the story of Exodus, the story of the flight of the Hebrew people from the bondage of Egypt through the wilderness and finally to the promised land. It's a beautiful story. I had the privilege the other night of seeing the story in movie terms in New York City, entitled The Ten Commandments, and I came to see it in all of its beauty, the struggle of Moses, the struggle of his devoted followers as they sought to get out of Egypt and they finally moved on to the wilderness and toward the promised land. This is something of the story of every people struggling for freedom. It is the first story of man's explicit quest for freedom, and it demonstrates the stages that seem to inevitably follow the quest for freedom. Prior to the 6th of 1957, there existed a country known as Gold Coast. The country was the colony of the British Empire, and this country was situated in the vast continent known as Africa. I'm sure you know a great deal about Africa, that continent with some 200 million people, and it extends and covers a great deal of territory. There are many familiar names associated with Africa that you probably remember, and there are some countries in Africa that people never realize. For instance, Egypt is in Africa, and there is the vast area of North Africa with Egypt and Ethiopia, with Tunisia and Algeria, Morocco and Libya. Then you might move to South Africa, and you think of that extensive territory known as the Union of South Africa. There is the capital city, Johannesburg, that you read so much about these days. There is Central Africa with places like Rhodesia, the Belgian Congo, and then there is East Africa with places like Kenya, Tanzania, and places like Uganda and other very powerful countries right there. And then you move over to West Africa where you find the French West Africa, Nigeria, Liberia, and Sierra Leone, and places like that. And it is in this spot, in this section of Africa, that we find the Gold Coast, there in West Africa. As you know, for years and for centuries, Africa has been one of the most exploited continents in the history of the world. It's been the dark continent. It's been the continent that has suffered all of the pain and affliction that could be mustered up by all the other nations. And it is the continent which has experienced slavery, which has experienced all of the lowest standards that we can think that have been brought into being by the exploitation inflicted upon it by other nations. And this country, the Gold Coast, was part of this extensive continent known as Africa. It's a little country there in West Africa with about 91,000 miles in area, with a population of about 5 million people, a little more than 4.5 million. And it stands there with its capital city, Accra. For years, the Gold Coast was exploited and dominated and trampled over. The first European settlers came in there about 1444. The Portuguese, and they settled legitimate trade with the people in the Gold Coast. They started dealing with them for their gold, and in turn they gave them guns and ammunition and gunpowder and that type of thing. But pretty soon America was discovered, and a few years later, in the 1400s, and then in the British West Indies. All of these growing discoveries brought about the slave trade. You remember it started in America in 1619, and there was a big scramble for power in Africa. With the growth of the slave trade that came into Africa, into the Gold Coast in particular, not only Portuguese, but also Swedes and the Danes, and the Dutch and the British, and all of these nations competed with each other to win the power of the Gold Coast so they could exploit these people for commercial reasons and sell them into slavery. Finally, in 1850, Britain won out and she gained possession of the total territorial expansion of the Gold Coast from 1850 to 1957. March 6th, the Gold Coast was a colony of the British colony, and as a colony she suffered all of the injustices, all of the exploitation, all of the humiliation that come as a result of colonialism. But like all slavery, like all domination, like all exploitation, it came to the point that people got tired of it. And that seems to be the long story of history. There seems to be a throbbing desire that seems to be an internal desire for freedom within the soul of every man. And it is there. It might not break forth in the beginning, but eventually it breaks out. For men realize that freedom is something basic. To rob a man of freedom is to take him from the essential basis of his manhood. To take him from his freedom is to rob him of something of God's image. To paraphrase in the Shakespeare's Othello's, who steals my purse steals trash. 'Tis nothing, 'tis something. 'Twas mine, 'tis his. Has been a slave to thousands. But he that flinches from me my freedom robs me of that which not enriches him, but makes me poor indeed. There is something in the soul that cries out for freedom. There is something deep down within every man that cries out